From 1945 to 1948, in spite of a cruel British naval blockade, 10 aging ships smuggled about 70,000 Holocaust survivors into the Promised Land. As one of them who made it said,
"It was better to risk dangers at sea and the British fleet than to stay in Europe. For the first time in years, we had a purpose: to create a Jewish state."
Millions of Jews have returned to Israel from more than 100 countries. Israel's existence today in the Promised Land is undeniably God's doing.
"Behold, I will bring them from the north, from the coasts of the earth. He that scattered Israel will gather him."
The United Nations adopted UN Resolution 181 in November 1947. It partitioned Palestine, giving 18% to the Jews and 82% to the Arabs, and made Jerusalem an international city, never to be under Jewish control, as the Vatican also insisted. The Arab world rejected the UN decision, demanded all of Palestine. To this day, no Arab map shows Israel's existence. May 14, 1948, Israel declared independence. It was immediately invaded by 6 Arab nations. These armies outnumbered the Jewish settlers many times over and had overwhelming superiority in weapons, tanks, and planes. Given an indefensible narrow strip of land by the UN and attacked by enemies determined to exterminate her, Israel should have been annihilated. But to the astonishment of a watching world that was cheering for the other side, the Israeli settlers soundly defeated their would-be destroyers, exactly as God had promised. And so it has been, in war after war, as her enemies have repeatedly attacked to annihilate Israel. Yes, annihilation is their determined purpose. Muslims have a religious duty to exterminate the Jews. They dream of destroying Israel and hold celebrations to honor murderers of innocent Israeli citizens. Islamic fundamentalism is now sweeping the world. Muhammad himself declared,
"The last hour will not come before the Muslims fight the Jews and the Muslims kill them."
Yet the media calls Muslim terrorists radicals and extremists. In fact, they are simply being true to Islam. The Quran declares,
"Take not the Jews and Christians as friends. Slay the idolaters wherever you find them. Besiege them, and prepare for them each ambush."
Hitlerian threats pour continuously from Muslim religious and political leaders on TV and over radios and loudspeakers, in mosque and street. When Gaddafi screams, "The battle with Israel will be such that Israel will cease to exist," he speaks for all. The extermination of Israel is bred into Muslims in their mother's milk. A Syrian minister of education wrote,
"The hatred which we indoctrinate into the minds of our children from birth is sacred." A 9th grade textbook in Egypt declares, "Israel shall not live if the Arabs stand first in their hatred." And a 5th grade textbook says, "The Arabs do not cease to act for the extermination of Israel."
Israel is insane to attempt peace with such enemies, but worldwide pressure forces her to. In the Yom Kippur War of 1973, thousands of tanks swept simultaneously across the Sinai from Egypt and down the Golan from Syria in a carefully coordinated sneak attack. Israel's military forces were all on leave, celebrating the holiest of Jewish religious holidays, and it took 3 days to fully mobilize. 300,000 Israelis fought 1.2 million Arabs. Teetering on the brink of defeat, Israel's casualties were heavy. But in undeniable fulfillment of Zechariah's astonishing prophecy that Jewish forces would be like fire to devour the surrounding nations, Israel routed her enemies. In retaliation for Israel defending itself, 61 nations broke diplomatic relations with her, but none rebuked the Arabs for their sneak attack. Israel's desperate and costly self-defense is consistently portrayed as wanton aggression against its peace-loving neighbors. Anti-Semitism motivates world media, which is largely controlled by oil interests. Not a word of criticism appears in response to repeated Arab vows to exterminate Israel. When Israel deported 400 Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists who had murdered and maimed hundreds of Israeli citizens, there was a hue and cry in world media in condemnation by the United Nations. But when Kuwait deported 300,000 Palestinians, mostly innocent civilians, the media hardly noticed, and the UN ignored it. The United Nations is blatantly pro-Arab and anti-Israel. The UN's, quote, peacekeeping force, unquote, in Lebanon sheltered PLO terrorists, allowed them to use UN facilities for training, gave them military equipment, and assisted terrorist squads on their way to attack Israel. When Israel, in desperation, finally invaded southern Lebanon to clear out the PLO, it uncovered within the UN area caches of enough military hardware to sustain a 1 million-man invasion. Most of it, interestingly enough, was too sophisticated for the PLO to operate and was obviously intended for a Soviet invasion. The United Nations has condemned Israel more than 370 times for defending itself, but has never condemned the terrorists and aggressors who attack her. 2 years after the PLO's murder of 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics, terrorist leader Arafat was invited to address the UN General Assembly and given a hero's welcome, though he called for an end to Israel's existence. UN Secretary General Boutros Ghali declared,
"The Jews must give up their status as a nation and Israel as a state and assimilate as a community in the Arab world."
Temple Mount on the summit of Mount Moriah is the heart of Jerusalem. This 35-acre parcel arouses such explosive passions that it could trigger World War III at any time. This is where Abraham obediently built an altar and bound his son Isaac upon it to offer him as a sacrifice to God. But God stopped him and provided a ram in Isaac's place. 900 years later, about 3,000 years ago, that sacred ground was purchased by King David from Ornan the Jebusite to build there an altar to God. And it was there that Solomon built the first temple. The Jewish temple, twice destroyed, is gone. In its place sits the Dome of the Rock, a monument to Islam's Jew-hating moon god, Allah. Israel's capture of East Jerusalem in 1967, and with it the Temple Mount, seemed to contradict Christ's prophecy of Jerusalem being trodden underfoot by the Gentiles until his return. But incredibly, Israel immediately gave the Temple Mount back to the custodial care of King Hussein of Jordan, who turned it over in 1994 to Yasser Arafat and his PLO. Thus, the very heart of Jerusalem remains in Gentile hands, and the Gentile nations of the world demand control. Central to the Middle East conflict today is the issue of the so-called Palestinian people, the Palestine Liberation Organization.